Nora Voss threw the eviction notice into the fire before the ink had time to cool. She didn't cry. She'd already used up every tear she had the night the bankmen came with their papers and their cold eyes and their practiced apologies that meant nothing. She was 41 years old. She had $11 to her name, and the town she'd given 17 years of her life to had already started looking through her like she was smoke. She picked up her trunk. She walked out the door. She didn't look back once. If this story moved something in you, if you've ever had to start over when you had nothing left to start with, please subscribe to this channel and follow Nora's story all the way to the end. Leave a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The wagon seat was hard, and the October wind cut straight through Nora Voss's wool coat, like the fabric wasn't even there. She sat with her trunk wedged behind her, her satchel pressed between her knees, and her eyes fixed on the flat, wide nothing, stretching out ahead of the livery driver's two tired horses. The plains didn't care that she was cold. The plains didn't care about anything, and right now that suited her fine. She had not spoken since leaving Caldwell. The driver, a heavy-set man named Dub, who smelled of pipe tobacco and had a habit of clearing his throat every few minutes, had tried twice to make conversation and given up both times when she answered with nothing more than a nod. She wasn't being rude. She was concentrating. She was going over the letter again in her head, the one folded into the front pocket of her satchel, the one she'd already read so many times. The paper had gone soft at the creases. Seeking capable woman. Honest character, experienced in figures and accounts. Room and board provided. Ranch work expected. Inquire through Halverson Livery, Caldwell, Kansas. Ask for C. Larimer. That was the whole of it. No promises, no flattery, no mention of wages beyond room and board. Any sensible woman would have set that letter aside and kept looking. Nora had read it 3 times, walked straight to Halverson's, and told the man behind the counter she was the one they were looking for. She was not a woman who had the luxury of being sensible anymore. The trouble had started, as most trouble does, quietly, and a long way before she'd noticed it coming. Her husband, Gerald, had been a decent man, not a passionate one, but steady and careful. And for 17 years, that steadiness had been enough. He ran a dry goods store on the main street of Caldwell. She kept the books. They were not rich, but they were solid, and solid had always felt like plenty. Gerald died in March of a lung sickness that took him in 3 weeks flat so fast she hadn't had time to prepare herself, and the moment he was in the ground, the steadiness she'd built her life on began to come apart at the seams. She discovered the debt within a month. Not Gerald's fault. Not really. Drought years had thinned their customers down to almost nothing, and he'd borrowed to keep the shelves stocked. Kept borrowing, never told her how deep it had gotten, because he was ashamed, and because he thought it would turn around. It didn't turn around. The bank sent their man in May. The store was gone by June. The house followed in August, and by September, Nora Voss was sitting in a rented room above the milliner's shop with her trunk and her satchel, and $11 listening to the town she'd lived in for nearly 2 decades go about its business below her window like she had already ceased to exist. People she'd known for years crossed the street when they saw her coming. Not from cruelty exactly, she'd told herself, that tried to believe it, but from discomfort. A widow with nothing made people uncomfortable. She was a reminder of how fast solid could turn to ruin, and nobody wanted that reminder at close range. She'd asked about work. She was good with figures, meticulous and fast, and she'd kept the store's books without error for the full 17 years of her marriage. The bank manager had smiled at her in a way that didn't reach his eyes and told her he had no positions suitable for a woman. The feed merchant said the same thing with less polish. The land office said they'd keep her name in mind, which meant they wouldn't. And then she'd found C. Larimer's notice tacked to the board at Halverson's, and here she was. Dub cleared his throat for what felt like the 15th time and finally spoke without asking her permission. "Larimer's place is another 4 miles out. You know him." "No," Nora said. "Quiet fella. Lost his wife 2 winters back. Runs a decent-sized cattle operation, or did before the pricing went sideways on him." Dub paused. He's fair far as I know. Doesn't drink. Doesn't run his mouth. Nora looked at the road ahead. That's fine by me. Dub nodded like she'd confirmed something he already suspected and didn't try to talk again after that. The ranch appeared out of the flatland slowly, the way things do on the plains. First the windmill, then the roofline of the barn, then the house itself, a 2-story frame structure that had been white once and was now the color of weathered bone. Functional. No ornamentation. The kind of house built by someone who had thought carefully about what he needed and not at all about what might impress a visitor. Dub pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the porch, and before he'd even set the brake, the front door opened, and Cole Larimer came out. Nora's first thought was that he was younger than she'd expected. Her second thought was that he moved like a man who'd been tired for a long time and had made his peace with it. He was lean and dark-haired, with the kind of weathered face that comes from years of outdoor work, not age, and he wore no expression that she could read from a distance. He came down the porch steps and stopped at the foot of them and looked at her with dark, direct eyes. "Mrs. Voss," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Larimer," she said, climbing down from the wagon before Dub could think to offer his hand. Cole looked at her for a moment, then at the trunk in the wagon bed, then back at her. "I'll get that. I can manage it." "I'm sure you can," he said, already moving past her toward the wagon. "I'll get it anyway." She stood back and let him. There was no point arguing with a statement like that, and she didn't have the energy to win a fight over who carried a trunk. She picked up her satchel and followed him inside. The kitchen was the first room she saw, and it was the room that told her everything she needed to know about the current state of Cole Larimer's life. It was not dirty. She could see he was a man who kept things from becoming filth. But it was a room that had been maintained rather than lived in. The dishes were clean and stacked with precision. The table had nothing on it. The window above the sink was bare of any curtain. It was a room where a man ate what he needed to eat and then left. Cole set her trunk down near the staircase and turned to face her. "I'll show you upstairs first." "That can wait," Nora said. "Tell me what the books look like." He stopped. Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, but close enough. "You want to see the accounts before you see your room." "I want to know what I'm working with," she said. "The room will still be there after." He looked at her for another moment, then turned and walked toward a narrow door off the kitchen. She followed him into what served as his office, a small room with a roll-top desk, 2 chairs, and a shelf of ledgers that made her chest tighten the moment she laid eyes on them. Not because they were disorganized, because she could see from across the room that they were 3 years out of date on their pricing columns. "Sit," she said, pulling out the chair at the desk without waiting for permission. Cole sat in the second chair. He watched her pull the nearest ledger onto her lap and open it with the practiced ease of someone who had been reading numbers since before she could read words. The silence stretched out, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who had both learned that words were only useful when they had something to carry. Nora worked through the ledger for 15 minutes without speaking. Cole didn't interrupt. He sat with his forearms on his knees and waited, and she registered in some part of her attention she kept separate from the numbers that he was a man who knew how to wait without making the waiting into pressure. "Your cattle prices," she said finally. "You've been using the 1877 market figures." "That's what's in the ledger." "It's 1880, Mr. Larimer. The market's dropped considerably since then. You've been calculating your margin against numbers that haven't been accurate for 3 years. She looked up at him. "You're not as solvent as these books suggest." He didn't flinch. "How bad? I need to go through the rest of this before I can tell you exactly." She set the ledger on the desk and folded her hands on top of it. "But I'll tell you this much, you were right to send that notice to Halverson's. You needed someone looking at these." Cole leaned back in his chair and studied her with those quiet, dark eyes. "You're not going to soften it?" "No," she said. "I'm not." For the first time since she'd arrived, something that was almost a smile moved across his face. It was brief, and it didn't quite reach his eyes, but it was there. "Good," he said. "I've got enough people softening things. Go through the rest of it. I'll get supper on." "I can do supper," Nora said. "You can do both," he said, already standing. "But you're doing the books first. That's what I brought you out here for." She turned back to the ledger. Behind her, she heard him move into the kitchen, heard the stove door open, heard the solid competence of a man who knew his own routines. She found herself settling, not relaxed, not easy, but settled the way she used to feel when she was at her own desk in the back of the dry goods store, with a fresh ledger and a sharpened pencil and a clear task in front of her. She had not felt that way since March. She worked through 2 more ledgers before the smell of salt pork and cornbread pulled her back into her body enough to remind her she hadn't eaten since morning. She came into the kitchen, and Cole was already setting plates on the table, with the economical movements of a man who had been feeding himself alone for long enough that it required no thought. "Sit," he said the same word she'd used at his desk, and she sat. They ate without much conversation. He asked her twice if she needed anything, and she said no both times, and he accepted that without pushing. The food was plain and sufficient, and she ate every bite of it, which she suspected told him something he wouldn't comment on. When the plates were cleared, he poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her without asking, and she wrapped both hands around it and felt the warmth move up through her palms. "The room's ready upstairs," he said. "End of the hall on the left. If there's something missing that you need, write it down, and I'll get it next time I'm in town." "I don't need much," she said. "Didn't figure you did." He drank his coffee. "Tomorrow I'll want to go over the accounts with you. Not tonight, you've had a long day." "I'd rather go over them tonight." He looked at her across the table. "You sure about that? I work better when I know what I'm dealing with. I sleep better too." She met his gaze. "I found something in the 3rd ledger this afternoon that concerns me. I want to talk it through before it sits in my head all night." Cole set his cup down slowly. "What did you find?" "A secondary note," she said. "From a man named Martin Seal." The change in his expression was not dramatic. It was the change of a man who'd been expecting bad news to arrive and was now watching it come through the door. "What about it?" "The terms on that note have a clause in them that I've seen used before. In Caldwell, about 4 years back, a land agent named Pruitt used an identical clause to claim a property out from under a family when they missed a single quarterly installment by 11 days. She kept her voice level factual, the same way she'd always delivered difficult numbers to Gerald when the store's figures came up short. The clause allows the note holder to call the full balance immediately if he determines at his sole discretion that the value of the collateral has declined. Cole was very still. "The collateral on your note with Seal," she said, "is this ranch." The kitchen was quiet except for the wind finding some gap in the eave above the window and making itself known. "He can call it," Cole said. "It wasn't a question. If he decides to, and if your books show what I think they're going to show when I finish going through them, he can make a reasonable argument that the ranch's operating value has declined enough to trigger that clause." She watched his face. "Has he been in contact with you recently?" "He was in town last month," Cole said. "Stopped by Halverson's, asked around about how the cattle operation was doing." His jaw tightened. "I didn't think much of it at the time." "He's watching," Nora said. "I've seen this pattern before. He waits until the numbers look bad enough on paper, then he moves." She put both hands flat on the table. "But there's something else. I need to see the original note, not just the ledger entry. If the clause is written the way I think it is, there may be a counter provision that limits when he can invoke it. I've seen that too. It's less common, but it's there, sometimes a recording requirement, a notice period, a condition that has to be met before the clause activates. You think there's a way out?" "I think there may be," she said carefully. "I'm not going to tell you there's a way out until I've read every word of that note myself." She looked at him steadily. "Where is it?" Cole stood and left the kitchen. She heard him in the office, heard the sound of the roll-top desk being opened all the way, heard paper moving. He came back with a document and set it on the table in front of her. She pulled it toward her and began to read. Cole sat back down across from her, and she was aware of him watching her face the way people watch the face of a doctor reading a chart. Not the words, but the reader looking for the first signal of what the words mean. She read it twice. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, organizing what she'd found. "There's a recording provision," she said, "buried in the third paragraph of the secondary terms. In order to invoke the clause, Seal has to file a formal notice of intent with the county recorder's office no less than 30 days before he calls the balance. And that filing has to include a documented assessment of the collateral's current value." She tapped the paper. "If we can get to the recorder's office first and file a counter documentation, your own assessment properly witnessed and signed, showing the current operating value and the basis for it, it limits his ability to claim the decline was as severe as he'll argue it is." Cole leaned forward. "You can put that together." "I can put together the accounting side of it," she said. "The figures, the documentation, the valuation basis. What I can't do is tell you whether Seal has already filed. If he has, we may be inside that 30-day window and we'll need to move fast." "Then we go to the recorder's office first thing tomorrow." "First thing tomorrow," she agreed. She folded the note carefully and pushed it back toward him. "And tonight, I'm going to finish going through those ledgers, all of them. I need to know exactly what the numbers look like before we walk into that office." Cole looked at her for a long moment. In the lamplight, his face was harder to read than it had been in the afternoon, but she caught something in his expression that wasn't there when she'd arrived. Not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The look of a man who had been carrying something alone for long enough that the weight had become invisible to him until just now. "I'll make more coffee," he said. "I'd appreciate that," she said, and pulled the next ledger toward her. They worked past midnight, the two of them, at that bare kitchen table, Nora with the ledgers and her pencil and the neat columns of figures she was recalculating from scratch, Cole across from her answering her questions when she had them and keeping quiet when she didn't. He was not a man who filled silence with noise, and she found herself grateful for it in a way she hadn't expected. At some point he got up and put more wood in the stove without asking if she was cold, and she was cold, and she didn't say anything, just felt the warmth begin to build back into the room and kept working. Around 1 in the morning, she set her pencil down and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment. "Tell me," Cole said. She lowered her hands and looked at him. "The operating value is down from where it was in '77, but it's not as bad as Seal is going to claim it is. The cattle numbers are lower, but your land value has held, and your equipment is in better condition than most ranches of this size. If we document the full-picture land livestock equipment, outstanding receivables, and file it properly, we can establish a current value that undermines whatever figure Seal brings to the recorder. Can we win?" She looked at him straight. "I think we can." He nodded once slowly. It was the nod of a man who had learned not to celebrate too early, but who had allowed himself to acknowledge that the odds had shifted. "Get some sleep," he said. "We leave at first light." Nora gathered the ledgers into a neat stack and pushed back from the table. She was tired in a way that went all the way down to the bone, the kind of tired that comes not from a single long day, but from months of scraping and worrying and lying awake in a rented room listening to a town not think about her. She picked up her satchel and started for the stairs. "Mrs. Voss?" She turned. Cole was still at the table, his hands around his coffee cup, looking at her with those quiet, dark eyes. "I'm glad you answered the notice," he said. It was plain and direct, and utterly without embellishment, the same way he said everything. Nora stood in the doorway and thought about $11 and an eviction notice she'd thrown into a fire and a town that had learned to look through her. "So am I," she said, and meant it, and went upstairs to her room at the end of the hall on the left. She did not lie awake. For the first time in months, she did not lie awake. Nora was up before the sun. She hadn't needed an alarm, hadn't needed anything to pull her out of sleep, because the truth was she'd been half awake since 4 in the morning, running numbers in her head the way she always did when something important was at stake. Not anxiously, not frantically, but with the steady, methodical turning of a mind that had been trained since girlhood to find the error before the error found her. She dressed quickly, came downstairs, and found the stove already warm and Cole already gone from the house. She could hear him in the barn through the kitchen wall, the low, steady sounds of a man doing morning chores, the shift of horses, the drag of a feed bucket. She put water on for coffee, located the cornmeal, and had breakfast half finished by the time he came back through the door. He stopped when he saw the skillet. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know I didn't," she said, and set a plate on the table. He washed his hands at the basin and sat down, and for a few minutes they ate in the same silence. They'd settled into the night before, not awkward, not forced, just the natural quiet of two people who had already moved past the stage of performing politeness at each other. "I've been thinking about the documentation," Nora said, refilling her coffee. "The valuation we put together last night is solid on the livestock and the equipment. What I'm less certain about is how the county recorder is going to respond to a self-reported land assessment. If Seal has already filed, his number is going to have been submitted by someone with an official appraisal certificate." Cole looked at her across the table. "What do we need?" "A witness," she said. "Someone who can stand behind the figures I've put together. Not a lawyer. We don't have time for a lawyer, but someone in this county whose name carries weight. Someone the recorder's office knows and respects." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Elias Hearn," he said. "Who is he?" "Runs the largest cattle operation in the county. He's been ranching here for 30 years, served on the county land board for 12 of them. His signature on a document carries about as much weight as anything official." Cole paused. "He's also not a man who gives his name to things he doesn't believe in." "Can you get him to look at the figures?" "I can ask." Cole stood, took his plate to the basin. "His place is 8 miles north. If we go there first, then ride to the recorder's office, we lose maybe 2 hours. 2 hours is manageable if Seal hasn't filed yet." Nora looked at him. "And if he has, then we move as fast as we can and hope the 30 days isn't already half gone." Cole reached for his hat on the hook by the door. "I'll hitch the wagon." She had the documentation bundled and tied before he had the horses ready. She'd been up before dawn, not just running numbers, but organizing everything she'd compiled from the ledgers into a clear, sequential argument that a county recorder or a judge or any literate adult could follow without needing to understand accounting. She had learned a long time ago that good figures meant nothing if the person reading them couldn't understand what they were looking at. The argument had to be plain. It had to be irrefutable. It had to read like truth, which it was, which was the one advantage they had over Martin Seal. Seal was going to come in with a manufactured number. She was coming in with the real one, documented from 3 years of the ranch's own records, cross-referenced and dated and witnessed. She climbed onto the wagon seat, and Cole put the horses into motion without ceremony, and the flat October land opened up around them again, wide and pale and indifferent. "Tell me about Seal," she said. Cole's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "He's been buying up land in this county for 6 years, not ranching it, flipping it. He finds operations that are struggling, gets his money into them through notes like, 'Mine waits for the right moment,' calls the balance, and takes the property when they can't pay." He kept his eyes on the road. "He's done it 4 times that I know of. There may be more. And nobody's stopped him. Everything he does is legal," Cole said. "That's the point. He's not breaking any laws. He's using the laws." Nora thought about the Pruitt case in Caldwell, the family she'd watched lose their land to a clause buried in the fine print of a note they'd signed without reading carefully enough because they'd been desperate, and the man across the desk from them had a reassuring smile. "How did you end up with his note?" she said. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones before it. It had weight to it. 2 years ago," Cole said. "After Margaret died. The ranch was behind. I'd spent money on doctors, on medicine, on things that didn't save her anyway, and I needed to bridge a gap to make it through the winter. Seal was in town. He presented himself as a private lender. Good terms, reasonable rates." Cole's hands tightened on the reins. "I should have read it more carefully." "You were grieving," Nora said. "That's not an excuse." "No, she said. But it's a reason. She looked at the road ahead. He timed it deliberately. Men like Seal look for moments like that. They look for the exact point when someone is distracted enough to sign something without reading every line. She paused. It's not ignorance on your part. It's predation on his. Cole didn't respond to that, but something in the set of his shoulders shifted the faintest loosening, and she didn't push it further. Elias Hearn's ranch came into view 40 minutes later, and it was immediately obvious that this was a different scale of operation, more buildings, better maintained fencing. The organized evidence of a man who had been running cattle successfully for 3 decades. A woman came out onto the porch as they pulled up, wiped her hands on her apron and called into the house. By the time Cole had set the brake, Elias Hearn was at the door. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and white-haired, with the kind of face that had been shaped by weather and decision-making in equal measure. He looked at Cole, then at Nora, then back at Cole. "Larimer," he said. "Who's this?" "Nora Voss," Cole said. "She's working my books. We've got a problem, and I need 20 minutes of your time." Hearn looked at Nora with the frank assessing gaze of a man who didn't waste time on social performance. "You the one who found it?" "Yes, sir," she said. "Come inside then," he said, and turned back into the house. They sat at Hearn's kitchen table, which was larger than Cole's, and bore the evidence of a household that actually used it. A coffee ring, a newspaper folded open to the land listings, a child's drawing weighted down by a salt shaker. Nora spread her documentation out in front of Hearn and walked him through it in 10 minutes, clean and direct, no preamble, no softening. Hearn listened without interrupting. He had the discipline of a man who knew that asking questions before someone was finished talking was a waste of everyone's time. When she finished, he looked at the figures for a moment in silence. Then he picked up the page with the land valuation and read it again slowly. "This is accurate," he said. "It wasn't a question. It's drawn directly from 3 years of the ranch's own records," Nora said. "I can show you the source ledger for any number on that page." Hearn set the paper down and looked at Cole. "Seal was at the feed merchant's 3 weeks ago asking about your operation." Cole went very still. "You heard that. I hear most things in this county." Hearn leaned back in his chair. "I didn't know about the clause in your note, or I'd have come to you sooner. That's on me." He tapped the documentation with one thick finger. "This is good work. It's careful and it's thorough, and if it gets filed before his notice of intent, it limits what he can claim." He looked at Nora. "You know that you put it together." "Yes, sir," she said. "You want my signature on the valuation page, and a brief letter of attestation if you're willing," she said, "stating that in your assessment as a 30-year cattle operator in this county, the figures represent a fair and accurate picture of the ranch's current operating value." Hearn was quiet for a moment. His wife appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, didn't say anything, and disappeared again. It was the movement of a woman who had learned when her husband was thinking through something important and when to leave him to it. "Seal tried to get into my operation 6 years back," Hearn said finally. "I threw him off my land, but not everybody has the position to do that, and he knows it." He pulled the valuation page toward him and picked up a pen. "I'll sign it, and I'll write your letter." He looked up at Cole, then at Nora. "Get to the recorder's office before noon. Hal Brewer works the morning shift, and he's a fair man. If you can get it filed while Brewer's there, you're in better shape than if it sits until the afternoon clerk." Nora gathered the documents the moment Hearn finished writing the attestation letter, checked his signature, folded everything into the protective cover she'd made from a piece of oilskin she'd found in Cole's office. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. Cole shook Hearn's hand at the door, and the old man held it a beat longer than necessary. "You did right bringing someone in to look at those books," he said. "Should have done it sooner." "I know," Cole said. "Don't be too hard on yourself about it." Hearn glanced once at Nora. "Looks like you found the right person when you needed her." He let go of Cole's hand and went back inside. They were back on the road, inside 30 minutes of arriving, pushing the horses harder, now the recorder's office in Caldwell, their fixed point. The October sky had gone the color of pewter, and the wind had picked up, and Nora sat with the oilskin-wrapped documentation pressed against her side with one arm, not because she thought it would blow away, but because keeping her hand on it kept her focused. "You're not worried," Cole said, and it wasn't entirely a statement. "I'm very worried," she said evenly. "I'm just not going to let that be visible until after we've filed." He looked at her sideways. "Does that work?" "Usually," she said. "Not always." He almost smiled. She caught it at the edge of her vision and chose not to acknowledge it. "What happens if Seal's already filed?" Cole said. "What exactly happens?" "If he's filed his notice of intent, the 30-day clock is running," she said. "We'd need to move immediately to two things first. File the counter documentation today, regardless, to establish the record of our valuation. Second, find out exactly when he filed, because if we can prove his filing contained a materially inaccurate assessment of the collateral value and our documentation shows the real number he's overreached." She paused. "It becomes a more complicated argument, but it's not a lost one." "You've done this before," Cole said. "Not exactly this, but something like it." Nora was quiet for a moment. "In Caldwell 4 years ago, the family I mentioned, the Pruitt situation, I found the clause I put together, the counterfiling, I got it in front of the recorder." She looked at the road ahead. "We were 11 days too late. The notice period had already expired." Cole absorbed that. "What happened to them?" "They lost the land." She said it plainly, without drama, the way you say something that is simply true and cannot be softened by how you say it. A family that had been on that land for 9 years, gone in 30 days because of 3 lines buried in a document they'd signed on a hard winter afternoon when they needed money, and a man with a good suit and a confident voice offered it to them. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the weight of that story, and the one they were currently inside of, which was either the same story told again or a different ending to it, and she didn't know yet which one it would be. "That's why you read the note so carefully last night," Cole said. "That's why I read every note carefully," she said. "Every ledger, every contract. Because the thing that destroys people is almost never the thing they can see coming. It's the third paragraph of the secondary terms. It's the clause nobody reads because they trust the man across the desk." She looked at him. "I stopped trusting men across desks a long time ago." Cole nodded slowly. "Fair enough." They reached the outskirts of Caldwell just before 11. The town that had spent the better part of a year looking through Nora Voss was going about its ordinary morning business, and she felt the familiar pull of that old wound as the wagon rolled down the main street. The feed merchants, the bank, the milliner's shop, with the room above it where she'd spent August lying awake, and then she put it away. She had one task. The task was all that mattered. Cole pulled the wagon up in front of the county recorder's office, and they went in together. Hal Brewer was behind the counter, a slight, precise man in his 50s, with ink-stained fingers and the organized calm of someone who took the paperwork of land and money seriously as it deserved to be taken. He looked up when they came in. "Mr. Larimer," he said with the neutral recognition of a man who knew most of the county's landholders. "Morning, Hal," Cole said. "This is Mrs. Voss. She's here to file a documentation of valuation on my ranch property. We need to know first if there's been any filing against it in the last 30 days. Brewer looked at Nora, then at Cole, then reached for his logbook. The next 90 seconds were the longest Nora had stood through in recent memory. She kept her breathing steady and her expression neutral and her hand on the oilskin folder, and she watched Hal Brewer run his finger down the columns of his logbook with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who was not going to be rushed by the urgency of 2 people standing at his counter. He stopped. His finger stopped. He looked up. "There's a filing," he said. "Notice of intent on the Larimer property, submitted by a Martin Seal." He checked the date. "Filed 8 days ago." Nora felt it move through her. Not panic, something colder and more precise than panic. The sensation of a calculation shifting of variables rearranging. 8 days. 22 days left in the notice period. 22 days was not nothing. 22 days was workable. "We need to file a counter documentation," she said, and set the oilskin folder on the counter. A full valuation of the property's current operating value, supported by 3 years of the ranch's own records and attested by Elias Hearn. Brewer looked at the folder. Then he looked at her with something that might have been respect, or might have been the professional recognition of someone who had come prepared. He reached for the folder. "Let me see what you've got," he said. Cole stood beside her at the counter and said nothing, and she was glad for it, glad for the presence. Glad for the stillness, glad that he was a man who understood when to step back and let someone else carry the weight of the moment. She had the documents. She had the figures. She had Hearn's signature, and 22 days and every number she'd spent the night rebuilding from the ground up. Brewer read slowly and carefully the way a man reads something that is going to be part of the official record, and Nora stood straight and watched his face and waited. Brewer read for a long time. He turned pages slowly, ran his finger down columns, went back and reread 2 sections that Nora had anticipated would require a second look, the cross-referenced livestock valuation, and the equipment assessment, which she had been especially careful to document with purchase dates and condition notes, because those were the numbers Seal was most likely to contest. She had built the argument the way she used to build the store's annual accounting for the bank review, not just accurately, but defensively anticipating every challenge before it arrived. Brewer set the last page down and looked up. "This is thorough," he said. "It's complete," Nora said. "Every figure has a source document. Every source document is referenced by ledger page and date." Brewer looked at Cole. "Hearn signed off on the valuation assessment." "He did," Cole said. "You can send someone to verify it if you need to." "I know Elias Hearn's signature," Brewer said, and there was something dry and final in the way he said it. That meant the question was already settled. He pulled a fresh form from the drawer beneath the counter and uncapped his pen. "I'll record this as a counterfiling to the Seal notice. It goes into the official record today, time-stamped as of this morning." He looked at Nora. "You understand what this does and what it doesn't do. It establishes our valuation in the record before Seal can act on his notice," she said. "It doesn't nullify his filing. It creates a competing document that any subsequent proceeding would have to weigh." "That's right," Brewer said. "If Seal wants to move forward after this, he's going to have to go in front of Judge Calder and argue that his assessment of the property value is more credible than yours supported by Hearn." He paused. "That's a harder argument to make than he probably planned for when he filed." "That's the idea," Cole said quietly. Brewer began filling out the recording form with the careful, deliberate penmanship of a man who understood that official documents were only as good as the clarity of what was written in them. Nora watched his pen move and felt the first loosening of something that had been wound tight in her chest since she'd read the secondary note by lamplight the night before. They were not out of this, but they were no longer walking into it blind. Brewer stamped the form, entered it in the log, and handed Cole a receipt of filing. "Keep that," he said. "If this goes to a hearing, you'll need to produce it." Cole folded the receipt and put it inside his coat, without looking at it, which told Nora he was the kind of man who knew that looking too relieved too soon was its own kind of jinx. She respected that. She gathered the oilskin folder and the remaining documents, and they walked back out into the October street. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The town moved around them, a wagon passing 2 women talking outside the dry goods store, a dog crossing the road with the unhurried confidence of an animal that owned the street, and Nora stood in the middle of it and let herself breathe all the way out for the first time since the previous night. "We're filed," Cole said. "We're filed," she agreed. "Seal is going to find out within the week, probably sooner if he has anyone watching the recorder's office." "What does he do when he finds out?" "He has 2 options," she said. They started walking toward the wagon. "He can withdraw the notice and find a different approach less likely, because men like Seal don't retreat easily once they've committed to a move. Or he can push forward and take it to a hearing, which means he has to stand up in front of Judge Calder and argue that a full accounting of your ranch's records, attested by Elias Hearn, is wrong." She climbed up onto the wagon seat. "Either way, we've changed the shape of what he's facing." Cole untied the horses and climbed up beside her. You sound like you've done this before. I told you, she said. I was too late before. But you know how it works. I know how it works, she said. I know how men like Seal think. They're counting on you not having read what you signed. They're counting on you not having the numbers organized well enough to push back. They are almost never counting on someone like me. She looked at him. That's the one advantage we consistently have, and I intend to use every bit of it. Cole put the horses into motion, and Nora looked straight ahead as Caldwell moved past her on both sides. The street she'd walked for 17 years. The storefronts she knew by heart. The bank that had taken everything Gerald had built and handed her nothing but a receipt and an apology. She kept her expression neutral. She kept her spine straight. She let the town slide past her like water past a stone, and she didn't give it the satisfaction of her grief. They were half a mile outside of town when Cole said without looking at her, "The bank in Caldwell, was that where Gerald's debt was held?" She didn't answer right away. "Yes," she said. "Same bank that handles accounts for most of the county landowners." "Yes." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Harrison Mole runs that bank." "He does. He and Seal have been seen together," Cole said. "At the hotel restaurant in town. More than once more than coincidentally from what I've heard." He kept his eyes on the road. "I didn't put it together until right now." Nora felt it settle over her the way cold water settles all at once everywhere. She thought about Gerald's debt. She thought about the timing of the bank's move after his death faster than it needed to be more aggressive than the numbers required. She thought about the loan terms she'd reviewed in those final horrible weeks, the clauses she'd been too grief-blinded to read carefully enough at the time. She thought about Martin Seal showing up in Caldwell the year Gerald died, presenting himself as a private lender with reasonable rates and good terms. "Mr. Larimer," she said carefully, "who recommended Seal to you? When you were looking for a bridge loan 2 years ago? Who told you to go see him?" The silence that followed was 3 seconds long and felt considerably longer. "Harrison Mole," Cole said. The word landed between them, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. The wagon wheels moved over the road. The horses kept their pace. The plains opened up wide and empty on both sides and didn't comment on anything. "He's been feeding Seal clients," Nora said. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of something clicking into place. A mechanism she should have seen sooner, would have seen sooner, if she hadn't been so focused on the legal documents and the accounting and the immediate problem of the recorder's office. He identifies landowners who are struggling who come to him for help, who trust him because he runs the county bank, and trust is what county bankers trade in. And he sends them to Seal. And Seal moves in with his notes, Cole said. His voice had gone flat and hard in a way she hadn't heard from him before. Waits and takes the land. And the land either gets sold to someone else or folded into Seal's holdings, and eventually the bank finances the next owner. Nora pressed her fingers together in her lap. It's a circuit. Mole sends Seal the clients. Seal takes their land. The land goes back through Mole's bank. Everybody profits except the people who just lost everything they built. Cole's jaw was tight enough that she could see the muscle working in it. How do we prove that? We may not be able to, she said honestly. Not quickly and not with what we have right now. The immediate problem is still Seal and the notice of intent. But what you just told me changes the shape of this considerably. She thought for a moment, moving the pieces around. If Mole is involved and Seal decides to push this to a hearing, Mole may try to influence how it goes. Who testifies, what documents are considered, who has Calder's ear? She looked at Cole. Do you know anything about Judge Calder's relationship with the bank? He's not Mole's man, Cole said with a certainty that sounded like it came from something specific. Calder lost his father's property to a bank foreclosure 30 years ago. He's been skeptical of bank-connected dealings ever since. A pause. That's well known in this county. Then Seal is going to have a problem if he pushes this to a hearing, Nora said. And if he knows about Calder, he knows that, which means he may be more likely to withdraw than I initially thought. She folded her hands. Or he escalates in a different direction. tries to pressure you before it gets to a hearing, makes the cost of fighting uncomfortable enough that you settle. What does that look like? I don't know yet, she said, but I want you to tell me immediately if anyone approaches you, anyone at all about the note or the ranch or any arrangement that involves settling the balance early. Don't agree to anything. Don't sign anything. Come to me first. Cole looked at her sidelong. You're expecting him to move. I'm expecting him to be smart enough to know we've changed the board, she said. And smart men who are also dishonest men don't sit still when the board changes. They adjust. She paused. So do we. They reached the ranch in the early afternoon, and Nora went straight back to the office with the ledgers and the filed documentation and a fresh sheet of paper. She needed to reconstruct the timeline when Seal had approached Cole, when Mole had made the referral, when the note had been signed, when Seal had made his inquiries at Halverson's and the feed merchants, and map it against every transaction in the ranch's accounts for the same period. If there was a pattern, she would find it. If there was something buried in the numbers that connected Mole to Seal's timing, it would be there in the ledgers in the column of figures that never lied, even when the men who created them were lying with everything else they had. She was 3 hours into it when she heard the sound of a horse in the yard, and then Cole's voice outside talking to someone she didn't recognize. She didn't move from the desk. She kept working. If it was something she needed to know about, he would come and get her. 5 minutes later, he came into the office, and his face told her before his words did. Seal's man was just here, Cole said. Fella named Gideon Price. Seal sends him around on errands. His voice was controlled and cold. He had a message. What did he say? He said Seal is prepared to renegotiate the terms of the note, extend the payment period, lower the interest rate. Cole's eyes were fixed on her. In exchange for withdrawing the counter-filing. Nora set her pencil down very carefully. He wants us to pull our documentation from the recorder's office, she said. That's what Price said. She looked at the ledger in front of her for a moment, then looked up at Cole. He's afraid of the hearing. He doesn't want to stand up in front of Calder with our numbers and Hearn's signature on the other side of the room. She felt something sharp and certain move through her. If he was confident in his position, he wouldn't be offering to renegotiate. He'd be letting the notice period run. So we don't take it, Cole said. We absolutely do not take it, she said. If we pull that filing, we lose the record we've established. We lose Hearn's attestation on the date it was entered. We go back to the same vulnerable position we were in before yesterday. She stood up. What did you tell Price? I told him I'd think about it. Good, she said. That was right. You didn't close the door, and you didn't walk through it. She moved around the desk. Is Price still on the property? He wrote out. Then Seal hears your answer within the hour. She looked at Cole steadily. I need you to be certain about this, because once we send word back that we're not withdrawing, he is going to escalate. I don't know exactly how yet, but he will. Cole looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face that she'd been seeing in fragments since the night before, building slowly, the way stormlight builds on the horizon. Not readable all at once, but undeniable once you saw it for what it was. It was the look of a man deciding how much to trust, and deciding it in real time, in full awareness of what the decision cost. We're not withdrawing, he said. Nora nodded once. Then I need to keep working. I think there's something in the 1878 ledger that may matter. Give me 2 more hours. She went back to the desk, and he stayed in the doorway for a moment, and she was aware of him there without looking up. The same way she'd been aware of him across the kitchen table the night before, as a presence that was neither intrusive nor absent, calibrated to exactly the distance she needed without her having to ask for it. Then he left and the house went quiet and she worked. The 1878 ledger was the one that had bothered her since the first night of faint wrongness she hadn't been able to name yet because she'd been moving too fast to sit with it. She slowed down now. She went line by line, column by column, cross-referencing against the receipts she'd found in the back of the desk drawer, loose papers she'd organized into chronological order that morning before they'd left for Hearn's, and she was 40 minutes into it when she found it. A payment. A payment recorded in the ledger as a standard supply purchase, harness repair, listed as $12 paid to a vendor noted only by the initials HM. $12 was not a remarkable amount. HM was not a remarkable notation. But the date was the same week Seal had approached Cole about the note, and the vendor initials, when she cross-referenced them against every other supply purchase in 3 years of ledgers, appeared exactly once. Just this entry. Just this date. Just this amount. H.M. Harrison Mole. She stared at the entry for a long time. It wasn't proof. It wasn't anywhere close to the kind of documented evidence that would hold up in front of a judge. It was one payment, one set of initials, one suspicious alignment of dates. But it was a thread, and she had learned that threads pulled carefully and with patience had a way of unraveling exactly what they were attached to. She picked up her pencil and wrote the date, the amount, and the initials on a separate sheet of paper. Then she went back to the beginning of the 1877 ledger and started again. Outside, the afternoon light was fading. She heard Cole in the kitchen, heard the stove, heard the ordinary sounds of a man making supper in a house that was beginning slowly, cautiously, to feel like more than just a place where two strangers had made a transaction. She kept working, and somewhere in the back of her mind, beneath the numbers and the dates and the building pattern of what she was beginning to understand, she was aware of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not safety. She was too experienced and too careful to mistake proximity to safety for the thing itself, but the possibility of it, the shape of it just visible somewhere on the other side of all this hard work. She turned the page and kept going. She found the second entry at 8:30 that evening. It was in the 1877 ledger, 9 months before the one she'd already flagged, buried between a payment for fence wire and a notation about a veterinary visit. Same initials, HM. Same format, a vendor notation with no full name, no address, no description of goods or services rendered. $8 this time. And the date fell exactly 1 week before the first time Seal's name appeared anywhere in Cole's records, in a notation so small and casual, it would have looked like nothing to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. 2 payments, 2 dates, both preceding Seal's movements against Cole's property by exactly 1 week each time. She sat back and pressed her hands flat against the desk and made herself breathe slowly. This was still not proof. She knew that. But it was a pattern, and a pattern with 2 data points was something she could argue. A pattern with 3 would be something she could prove. She needed to find the third, and she was beginning to believe it was in the 1879 ledger, the one she hadn't been able to get to yet because Cole had been using it for current entries, and it had been sitting on the corner of the desk out of sequence. She reached for it. Cole appeared in the doorway at that exact moment with a plate of food, and a look on his face that said he'd been standing there deciding whether to interrupt her for longer than he'd probably admit to. "You need to eat," he said. "I found something," she said, and held up the page with her 2 notations on it. "Come look at this." He set the plate on the corner of the desk and leaned over her shoulder to look at what she'd written. He was close enough that she could hear him breathe, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cool office air, and she kept her attention on the paper, because that was what mattered right now. 2 payments, she said. Same initials, HM, both preceding Seal's moves against you by exactly 1 week, one in 1877, one in 1878. Cole was very still. "Those are in my ledgers. They are." "I didn't make those entries." She looked up at him. "I know you didn't. The handwriting is different from yours. I noticed it when I first went through these, but I didn't understand what I was looking at." She turned the ledger toward him and pointed to the entry. "Someone with access to your books made these entries. Someone who was tracking Seal's movements and recording payments that were being routed through your accounts without your knowledge." Cole straightened up slowly. The look on his face was the look of a man who had just understood that the thing he'd been robbed of was larger than he'd thought. "Mole," he said. "Or someone working for him who had access to your records," she said. "When did you last have your books looked at by anyone other than yourself?" Cole thought. She could see him going back through it, the same methodical backward movement she'd been doing all evening through the ledgers. 2 years ago, he said, when I took out Seal's note, Mole's bank required a review of the ranch accounts as part of the lending assessment. Who conducted the review? A man from Mole's office. Young fella, I don't remember his name. He was here for an afternoon. Nora looked at the ledger entry in 1877. This entry predates that by 2 years. Cole's expression shifted. The year before that, Mole's bank held my primary operating note, the one I paid off before Seal's. They did an annual review. Mole's man came out. The same man. I don't know. I'm not sure I'd recognize him if I saw him again. Cole's voice was flat and careful, in the way voices get when anger is being held at a very specific distance. They had access to the books, both times. And both times, Nora said, within a week of that access, a payment appears in your ledger that you didn't make in handwriting that isn't yours with initials that match Harrison Mole. She paused. They weren't just reviewing your accounts. They were using them, writing entries that made it look like money was moving through your operation in ways that served their documentation if they ever needed to show a judge that the ranch had financial irregularities. The silence in the office was absolute. He was building a case against me, Cole said. From inside my own books. That's what it looks like, she said. And if I'm right, there's a third entry somewhere in the 1879 ledger. I was just reaching for it when you came in. Cole reached past her and picked up the 1879 ledger and set it open in front of her without a word. She appreciated that more than she could have explained the immediate unquestioning trust of the action, the absence of any impulse to take the book and look for himself first. She found the third entry in 11 minutes. November 1879, $6. H.M. 7 days before Seal had shown up at Halverson's asking about the Larimer operation, 6 weeks before he'd filed his notice of intent. 3 entries, 3 dates, 3 movements by Seal that followed each one within a week. She put her pencil down and looked at Cole and said, "We need to go back to Hal Brewer." Cole looked at the 3 entries she'd laid out side by side on the desk, the dates written in her clean, clear hand beneath each one. He looked at them for a long time without speaking, and she watched something move through his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not the anger, which was still present, still controlled, but something underneath it. Something older and more private. "He sat in my kitchen," Cole said. "Mole did, when Margaret was sick. He came out with his condolences, and he sat at my table and drank my coffee and told me if I ever needed anything, any help at all, his door was always open." He stopped. And the whole time he was planning this, Nora didn't say anything. Some things didn't need commentary. Some things needed to be said out loud by the person carrying them, and the only useful thing another person could do was be present enough to receive it. "How do we use this?" Cole said finally. "Carefully," she said. "If we walk into Brewer's office tomorrow and lay these entries on his desk and say Harrison Mole has been manipulating your accounts, Mole's going to deny everything, Seal's going to deny everything, and without more than 3 suspicious ledger entries with matching initials, a good lawyer can argue it's coincidence." She folded her hands. "What we can do is file a supplemental addendum to the counter-documentation we already have on record. We add these entries, we note the discrepancy in handwriting. We note the dates against Seal's movements, and we ask the recorder to flag it for the judge's attention if this goes to a hearing. We put it in the official record." "We put it in the official record," she said, "so that if Seal pushes this to Calder, Calder sees it before either of them can shape the story." She paused. "And then we need a witness to the handwriting discrepancy. Someone who knows Cole Larimer's handwriting well enough to testify that those entries weren't written by you." Cole thought for exactly 3 seconds. "Ruth Calloway," he said, "runs the boarding house on 2nd Street in Caldwell. She's kept my accounts for the feed orders for 4 years. I write out the order sheets myself every month. She's got 4 years of my handwriting in her files. Can she be in town tomorrow morning?" "She's always in town," he said. "She doesn't go anywhere." He paused. "She also doesn't like Harrison Mole," He tried to buy her building 2 years ago, and she told him things I am not going to repeat. Something that was almost a smile moved across Nora's face. Good. We go to her first, then Brewer. She started gathering the ledgers into order. This is going to require a very clean presentation. The addendum has to be organized so that someone who knows nothing about accounting can follow the argument in a single reading. I'll work on it tonight. You haven't eaten, Cole said. I'll eat while I work. Nora. It was the first time he'd used her first name. Not Mrs. Voss, not the careful distance of formal address, but her name plain and direct, the way he said everything. She stopped what she was doing and looked at him. Eat first, he said. 20 minutes. The ledgers aren't going anywhere. She looked at the plate on the corner of the desk. Salt pork cornbread, a cup of coffee that was probably still warm, and then at the ledgers, and then at Cole, and something in her that had been running at full tension since the previous night loosened a single notch. 20 minutes, she said, and picked up the plate. They sat at the kitchen table again. The two of them, the lamp turned up against the dark, and for the first 20 minutes, they didn't talk about seal or mole, or the addendum, or the recorder's office. Cole talked about the ranch, not about the financial trouble, but about the cattle, about the particular personality of a difficult horse he'd been working with for 3 months, about the way the plains looked in early spring when the grass came back. He talked the way he did everything else economically, without embellishment, but with a quiet precision that meant every word was exactly the one he'd chosen. Nora found herself listening in a way she hadn't listened to anyone in a long time. Not processing, not calculating, not organizing what was being said into something useful. Just listening. You grew up here, she said. It wasn't a question. My father homesteaded this land in 1851, Cole said. I was born in this house. Margaret and I... He stopped, started again. We rebuilt the second story together the spring we got married. She wanted the extra bedroom. His voice didn't break. It just went quieter, which was its own kind of breaking. There was never a child for it. Nora looked at her coffee cup. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it without performance. So am I. He said the same way, plain final, carrying the whole weight of it in 4 words. But the house is still here. The land is still here. He looked at her across the table. That's what I'm fighting for. I know, she said. That's why I'm fighting for it too. He looked at her for a moment with those quiet dark eyes, and she held the look without flinching, and neither of them said anything else, and it was enough. She went back to the office and worked until 2 in the morning. The addendum she produced was 4 pages, organized into 3 sections. The ledger discrepancy, the handwriting comparison instructions for the court, and the timeline of Seal's movements against the corresponding entry dates. She wrote it the way she'd always written difficult financial arguments in language so plain and sequential that there was no way to read it and come away confused about what it was saying. She was not a lawyer, and she didn't pretend to be. What she was someone who understood that the truth laid out clearly enough had a power that obfuscation and manipulation could not always defeat. Not always, but often enough to be worth the fight. She folded the addendum into the oilskin folder with the original counter-filing receipt and set it on the corner of the desk and went upstairs and slept for 4 hours. In the morning, she came down, and Cole was already at the table with coffee, and she sat across from him, and they went over the plan for the day, in the same efficient, practical shorthand they'd been developing since that first supper. Ruth Calloway first. Brewer second. They would be in town by 9 if they left within the hour. They left within the hour. Ruth Calloway was a woman of about 60, with sharp gray eyes, and the bearing of someone who had been running her own establishment long enough that she no longer felt the need to make herself smaller for anyone. She listened to Nora's explanation of what she needed, a written statement attesting that she was familiar with Cole Larimer's handwriting, and that the 3 ledger entries Nora showed her were not written in that hand with the focused attention of a woman who took the weight of a request seriously before deciding how to respond to it. She looked at the entries. She looked at the order sheets in her files. 4 years of Cole's handwriting, precise and narrow and slanting slightly left. She looked at the entries again. These aren't Cole's, she said flatly. Not even close. His letters don't round like this, and he always crosses his sevens. Whoever wrote these entries doesn't cross their sevens. Would you be willing to put that in writing? Nora said. Ruth Calloway looked at her with the particular look of a woman who has assessed another woman and found her to be serious. Who are you going after? Martin Seal, Nora said, and possibly Harrison Mole. Ruth set down the ledger entry copies and picked up a pen. Where do I sign? She said. By 10 o'clock they were back at Brewer's counter with the addendum Ruth Calloway's signed statement clipped to the front of it. Brewer read it with the same slow thoroughness he brought to everything, and when he was finished, he looked up with an expression that was harder to read than his first one had been, more careful, more weighted, the expression of a man who understood that what he was about to file was going to make waves that would reach further than his counter. You understand this implicates Harrison Mole directly, he said. The documents implicate the initials HM, Nora said. The recorder's office can note what is in the record. We're not asking you to draw conclusions. We're asking you to record what's there. Brewer looked at Cole. This is going to get complicated. It's already complicated, Cole said. We're just making sure the right record exists before it gets more so. Brewer stamped the addendum, entered it, handed Cole a second receipt. They were back on the road inside 20 minutes, and they had been driving for less than 10 when Nora saw a rider coming toward them fast, too fast for a casual morning ride, the kind of speed that meant something had happened or was happening. The rider pulled up alongside the wagon, and she recognized him as one of Hearn's ranch hands, a young man named Cody, who'd been in the yard when they'd visited the day before. Mr. Larimer. Cody pulled his horse to a stop, breathing hard. Mr. Hearn sent me. Seal was at the recorder's office this morning, early before you got there. He tried to file an amended notice. Cole's hands tightened on the reins. What kind of amendment? Hearn doesn't know the details. But Brewer turned him away. Nora felt something cold and clarifying move through her. Brewer turned him away because our counterfiling was already in the record, she said. Seal tried to amend his notice to preempt our addendum, and Brewer had already stamped ours. Cody nodded. That's what Hearn figures. He also says Seal rode out of town toward the South Road about an hour ago, riding hard. South Road goes toward the territorial line, Cole said. Nora looked at him. He's running, she said, or regrouping. Either way, he knows the position has shifted. She paused. This isn't over, but he's lost the initiative. Cole looked at Cody. Tell Hearn thank you. Tell him we filed the addendum this morning. Cody nodded and turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come, and Cole sat for a moment with the reins loose in his hands, and Nora sat beside him and let the information settle into the space between them. He's going to come back, Cole said, or he's going to send someone. Probably, she said, but when he does, everything he faces will be in the official record. Every entry, every date, every signature. He can't unmake what's been filed. She looked at the road ahead. And neither can Mole. Cole put the horses into motion again, and the ranch appeared on the horizon the way it always did out here. Slowly, steadily, the way things that are built to last appear when you're coming home to them. 3 days passed without word from Seal. Nora knew better than to read that as peace. Men like Martin Seal didn't go quiet because they'd given up. They went quiet because they were deciding which angle to come from next, and the quiet was just the space between one move and another. She knew this, the way she knew numbers, not from instinct, but from having watched it happen before, from having lived inside the aftermath of it in a rented room above a milliner's shop with $11 and a town that had already moved on without her. So she kept working. She reorganized the entire filing system in Cole's office, cross-referenced every outstanding obligation against the current market figures she'd reconstructed, and produced a clean set of books that, for the first time in 3 years, reflected what the ranch actually was, rather than what it had been in 1877. When she was done, she set the finished ledgers on the desk in a neat stack and looked at them for a long moment and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing that had been broken being made whole again. Cole came in from the barn and saw the stack and stood in the doorway looking at it. "That's all of it," she said. He walked to the desk and picked up the top ledger and opened it and looked at the columns she'd rebuilt. She watched his face while he read, and saw the moment he understood the full picture. Not just the threat they'd been fighting, but the actual state of what he had clear and documented and real. "It's not as bad as I thought," he said. "It's not good," she said honestly. "But it's recoverable. If the cattle prices hold through spring and you can close the Henderson contract on the terms you described, you'll be in a stable position by summer." She paused, without Seal's note hanging over it. Cole closed the ledger and set it back on the stack and looked at her. "About the note," he said. "I've been thinking. Tell me, if we get through the hearing when we get through it, I want to pay it off completely, not make payments. Pay it off close it, get his name out of my books permanently." He crossed his arms. "I know the cash position doesn't support that right now." "It doesn't," she said. "Not immediately. But if you sell the eastern pasture grazing rights for the winter season, you're not using them. And Hearn mentioned he's short on grazeland this year. That's enough to cover the balance and leave a working margin." She looked at him. "It's a short-term sacrifice for a permanent solution." Cole was quiet for a moment, running the calculation she could see moving across his face. "You already figured that out," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was the tone of a man recognizing that someone had been thinking ahead of him and finding it more reassuring than unsettling. "I figured it out 2 days ago," she said. "I was waiting to see how the Seal situation resolved before I said anything. No point talking about closing the note if he was going to take the ranch." Cole almost smiled. "Practical," he said. "Always," she said. The letter from Judge Calder's office arrived on the 4th day, delivered by a county rider who handed it to Cole at the door and didn't wait for a response. Cole brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment before he picked it up the way a man looks at something he needs to open but wants one more second before the contents become real. Nora sat across from him and waited. He opened it and read it. Then he set it flat on the table and turned it toward her. She read it in 30 seconds. Then she read it again more slowly, making sure she had every word exactly right before she let herself understand what it meant. The notice of intent filed by Martin Seal had been reviewed by Judge Calder's office in light of the counter-documentation and supplemental addendum on record. The judge had determined that the original notice contained a materially inaccurate assessment of the collateral's current value, inconsistent with the documented evidence submitted by the counterfiling party. The notice of intent was hereby voided. Any subsequent claim against the Larimer property under the terms of the secondary note would require a new filing supported by a court-certified independent appraisal. Furthermore, the discrepancies noted in the supplemental addendum regarding the ledger entries had been referred to the county sheriff's office for investigation. Nora set the letter down on the table with both hands and sat very still for a moment. "It's over," Cole said. His voice was quiet, and she could hear everything in it, the relief, the exhaustion, the long wait of 2 years of carrying something alone beginning to come off. "The notice is voided," she said. "The investigation into Mole is just beginning. That part isn't over." She looked at him. "But the ranch is safe." Cole looked at her across the table. They had sat at this table in lamplight, going over numbers together, and they had sat at this table over plain suppers, saying very little, and they had sat here late at night with coffee cooling in their cups, and a problem between them that they had taken apart piece by piece, with their combined stubbornness, and refused to let defeat them. She knew this table now the way she'd known the table in the back of the dry goods store, not as furniture, but as the place where the real work happened. "I need to go see Hearn," Cole said. "He should hear this from me directly." "He should," she said. "He earned it." Cole stood and reached for his hat, and then stopped with his hand on it, and turned back to look at her, and she could see him working up to something which was unusual for him. He was not a man who needed to work up to things who circled around what he meant to say. When he spoke, he spoke. The fact that he was doing it differently now meant whatever was coming was different from anything he'd said before. "When I sent that notice to Halverson's," he said, "I told myself I needed someone for the books. That was the practical reason, and it was a true reason, and I held on to it because it was the kind of reason a man like me is comfortable with." He started again. But there was another reason. Margaret had been gone for 2 winters. The house had been... He paused. Empty isn't the right word. I was in it. But it was the kind of empty that's about more than whether there's another person present. Nora sat very still. I am not a man who says things he doesn't mean, he said. So I'm going to say this plainly, and you can tell me plainly what you think of it. He looked at her with those quiet, dark eyes that she had been reading slowly and carefully for 4 days now. I would like you to stay, not for the books, not for the work, for yourself. Because this house is better with you in it, and I don't want to go back to what it was before you got here. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through something and made a sound and then was gone. Nora thought about $11. She thought about an eviction notice burning in a fireplace and a town moving past her window like she was already a ghost. She thought about the wagon ride out here, cold and flat and purposeless, just survival with nowhere particular to survive toward. She thought about sitting at this table at midnight with a ledger and a pencil, and a man across from her who refilled her coffee without asking and put wood on the fire without being told, and never once made her feel like her competence was a problem that needed to be managed. She thought about the entry at the end of the 1879 ledger that she'd found last night, the one that had nothing to do with seal or mole or anything that required fixing, just a notation Cole had made himself in his narrow leftward handwriting with the crossed sevens. A notation from 2 years ago that read, simply, House repairs, east bedroom deferred. The bedroom Margaret had wanted for a child. He hadn't touched it. Hadn't been able to. She'd closed the ledger and not mentioned it because it wasn't her business. But she'd thought about it. She looked at Cole across the table and she said, I came here because I had nowhere else to go, and $11 and a set of skills I was afraid nobody was ever going to let me use again. That was why I answered your notice. She folded her hands on the table. But that's not why I stayed up until 2 in the morning for 3 nights running. That's not why I went to Hearn and Callaway and Brewer and fought for every word in that counterfiling. She paused. I did that because this ranch is worth fighting for. Because you are worth fighting for. And because somewhere in the middle of all of it, I stopped thinking about where I was going next. Cole was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Open in a way that his face was not usually open, all the careful, controlled distance he held between himself and things that could hurt him, set aside just for this moment, just here. Is that a yes? He said. That's a yes, she said. He nodded once, the way he nodded when something was settled and real, and he was prepared to build on it. Then he put his hat on and went to see Elias Hearn. She listened to the sound of his horse leaving the yard, and then sat at the table alone for a while, not working, not organizing anything, just sitting in the quiet of a kitchen that had started to feel like hers. 2 weeks later, Gideon Price came back. Nora was in the office when she heard the horse, and she came to the door and saw Cole already standing on the porch, not moving toward the rider, just standing there with his arms at his sides, and the kind of stillness that meant he was ready for whatever came next. Price pulled up short of the porch. He was not riding with the easy authority he'd had on his first visit. He looked like a man who'd been given a job he hadn't agreed to, like the job. Mr. Larimer, he said. Mr. Seal asked me to deliver a message. Say it, Cole said. He's withdrawing from the county, Price said. He's got interest in the territories and he's moving on. Price looked uncomfortable in a way that suggested he knew how this sounded. He wants you to know there's no further interest in your property. Cole looked at him for a long moment. Tell him I heard him, he said. Tell him not to come back. Price turned his horse and rode without another word. Cole stood on the porch and watched him go, and Nora came and stood beside him, and they watched the rider get smaller against the flat land until he disappeared into it, the way everything eventually does out here, swallowed by the distance gone, like it had never been. Mole, she said. The sheriff went to see him 3 days ago, Cole said. Word travels fast in this county. He paused. Seal knew before we did. He ran, she said. He ran, Cole confirmed. They stood there for a moment longer, the two of them side by side on the porch of a ranch that was still standing because she'd read a secondary note by lamplight and refused to look away from what it said. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Nora hadn't had since before Gerald died. Not the anxious routine of survival, but the real rhythm of a life being built deliberately with someone who showed up to it every day without reservation. Mornings they worked the ranch together, the practical business of cattle and maintenance, and the 100 small decisions that kept an operation functional. Afternoons, she kept the books refined. The documentation prepared the spring financial plan she'd been building toward since she'd first seen the state of the 1877 ledger. Evenings they sat at the kitchen table and ate whatever one of them had made that day and talked about practical things, and sometimes slowly, things that were less practical and more essential. She repaired the east bedroom window. She didn't tell him she'd done it. He noticed and didn't say anything either, and the silence around it was its own kind of language. Ruth Calloway came for supper one Sunday in November and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the two of them moving around the kitchen together with the unconscious coordination of people who had learned each other's rhythms, and she said to Cole without prelude, "She's good for this place." "I know that," Cole said. "I'm talking about more than the books," Ruth said. "I know that too," Cole said, and set a plate in front of her. In December, a letter arrived from the county sheriff's office informing Cole that Harrison Mole had surrendered his position at the bank and that an investigation into his business practices was ongoing. No charges had been filed yet, but the record was there. The record Nora had built entry by entry, page by page, night after night, at a desk in a small office in a ranch house on the plains. The record existed, and it was not going away. She read the letter twice, and then folded it and put it with the other documents in the oilskin folder she'd kept since the first filing, the folder she'd carried to Brewer's counter and to Hearn's kitchen table and back again. She put it on the shelf in the office where the ledgers lived, and she stood back and looked at the shelf for a moment and felt something complete itself that had been left unfinished for a very long time. Not in the documents, not in the case, in her. That evening Cole came in from the barn and washed up at the basin and sat down at the table and looked at her across it with those quiet dark eyes that she had come to know as well as she knew her own handwriting, and he said, "Stay." "I already said yes," she said. "I know," he said. "I just wanted to say it again." She looked at him across the table of a house that was hers now, not by deed, not yet, but by the only measure that had ever mattered to her, which was the measure of a life she had chosen with both hands. Open, eyes clear on her own terms, with no reason left to go. Some people find home by birth. Some people spend a lifetime looking and never find it at all. Nora Voss arrived at the edge of the plains with $11 a broken name and skills that a town full of people had refused to see, and she built home out of ledger pages and lamplight and the stubborn refusal to be defeated. And when she was done building it, she recognized it by the way it felt when she stopped running. She had come for the roof, she stayed for the man, and she never found a reason to leave.